Здравствуйте, как дела? And the rest will be in English. When you leave tonight, you will not know Tchaikovsky the way you did in the past. After you read the book, you'll never hear his music the same again. He spent his whole life tortured, searching for passion, for love. It's all in his music. His music is all autobiographical, more than any other composer. There is no biographer that denies that. But the backstory of Coda is equally interesting than the novel. It starts with the Tsars, and we'll see if this works. When Tchaikovsky was born, the Tsar was Tsar Nicholas I. Not a nice person. He was not Mother Teresa. Anyone that disagreed with him, anyone that insulted him, anyone that deflated his narcissism in the slightest disappeared.
Sounds like Trump. Got tweeted.
Sound familiar? He was hated by everyone. His closest allies hated him. There was hunger, there was starvation in Russia. People froze to death in their flats in the winter, and it's reported that he committed suicide. I doubt it very much. His son, Alexander II, inherited the throne, and he was just the opposite. He was a saint. Under Tsar Nicholas I, there were serfs. Serfs really are like slaves. They owe their lives to their landowners for protection, really, against marauding. He freed the serfs. It's a revolutionary concept. There was still hunger, starvation, freezing. He gave people hope. And the hope made him a saint. Everybody absolutely loved Tsar Alexander II. Tchaikovsky was 15 years old when he took power. He was just coming of age. There were crimes of morality under Tsar Alexander II, but they were rarely enforced. They were crimes punishable by death, but they were overlooked. During this reign, Tchaikovsky established, wrote 4 symphonies, the Russian Easter Overture, lots and lots of stuff. He became an idol of Russia. Everyone loved Tchaikovsky. He had a patron, Nadia von Meck, who sent him monthly checks. She never met him, but she admired him. During a procession, someone walked over to Tsar Alexander II's carriage, gave him a very ornamental box through the window of the carriage, placed it on his lap, and it exploded. He was gone. And after that came his son, Alexander III. He was worse than Nicholas I. He was narcissistic, self-aggrandizing. He commissioned Tchaikovsky to write the coronation march for his coronation. But he was hated. He was hated more than Nicholas I, for those that remembered. Tchaikovsky was 41 years old when he took the throne. Tsar Alexander III was only 36. He was so extreme, what we now call extreme conservative. He was savage, barbaric, tyrannical, and from the moment he took power, he believed that his popularity was waning. And he needed to blame somebody. He needed to cultivate anger and hate. That always seems to work. And the first thing he did was he blamed the Jews. In Russia, around the world, that seems to work. And he expelled the Jews from Moscow. Then he resurrected the hate theme and drove them out of St. Petersburg. When he was sure that they were out of the city, he then advertised that they were going to mow down the little villages, and the Cossacks came, mowed them to the ground, and people fled like cockroaches under a bright light. They just fled. And he then said, "Look how great I am." But that wasn't enough. He then went to the next source of power, the Russian Orthodox Church. And there was a price. The price with the Russian Orthodox Church is their ghastly morals and the ghastly penalties that go with these morals. There was rumblings of revolution. If you were gay under this period, you were sent to Siberia. If you knew someone was gay and didn't report it, you were sent. If some neighbor didn't like you and said, "gay," the Cossacks then swept you away, Siberia, where you either starved to death or froze to death, or beaten in the streets in a public celebration. Not a good time. That was not enough. He then decided he would have a culture war and show how cultural Moscow was, and he picked Paris, of all places, the cultural center of the world. La Belle Époque. This was in the late 1880s, the center of the cultural world, and he said, Moscow is better. But in 1889, to celebrate the centennial of the French Revolution in Paris, they had the World's Fair in Paris, the Paris Exposition, they called it. The Eiffel Tower was put up, the tallest building in the world, and in fact, it stayed the tallest building until the Chrysler Building was put up. Tsar Nicholas was crushed. He had lost the culture war. But on May 5th, 1891, Andrew Carnegie was set to open the grandest concert hall in the world. And Alexander III, he wanted the grandest musician in the world. He was ecstatic. He peed in his pants with joy because Andrew Carnegie wanted one musician to open it. He wanted Tchaikovsky. He sent a note to Alexander III, sent a note to Tchaikovsky. There was a lot of discussion. My God, he's going to be sending Tchaikovsky to New York. This was a shot to fire across the bow of Paris. But Tchaikovsky was gay. It was not widely known, in fact, it was not really known, but it was known in the royal circles. If Tchaikovsky was found to be gay in New York City, it would end everything. It would end his reign. I mean, here was a guy who was so thrilled with himself and how wonderful he was. If he was embarrassed to the world, it would be all over. Tchaikovsky was known to solicit male prostitutes. He went for the lower classes. He was interested in sailors. He was a slut. So here he was in New York City. What could go wrong? He wrote back to his brother Modeste. He wrote back to him frequently. By the way, Modeste was also gay. He wrote back about New Yorkers. They actually came up to him on the street, unannounced, and shook hands. Some people actually hugged him. And worst of all, he never could imagine people smiling on the street in public. It was not done in Moscow or St. Petersburg. Not at that time. Actually, not today either. So Alexander III instructed him, what you're going to conduct is the Coronation March. And And that's what was used to open Carnegie Hall, the coronation march for the coronation of Alexander III. He was given fantastic reviews. He was strong, he was healthy, he was vital, he was loved by New York City, and he was pronounced dead 2 years later. Alexander III knew gay. He had a gay brother. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich was gay. It was considered to be a secret. It wasn't. He was 6'2", blonde, reported to have brilliant green eyes, strutted around the royal court like a peacock. He was stereotypical in those days. In these days, he was a stereotype. He was assassinated when he was 47 years old. It's the Russian thing. Tchaikovsky's romances. In the spring of 1869, he met a student. I'm not sure if it was a student of his or a student recommended to him by his brother, Modeste. Edward Zach. Tchaikovsky was 29 years old, Edward Zach was 15. I have never seen pictures of Edward Zach, but the descriptions of him that Tchaikovsky wrote were stunning. He was madly in love with this young man. In fact, in his letters to his brother, he writes, Lyubov I pochat, love and lust. Those two words in the letters appear frequently. In different connotations, don't forget, letters in those days were like emails today. Nothing was private. Wax seals were melted and wax seals were put back on. His letters are all coded. But Lyubov I pochat appears many times, and in the autumn of that year, he writes a tone poem, Romeo and Juliet. It's about Romeo and Juliet, the conflict between the Montagues and the Capulets, the Sharks and the Jets, gay love and social mores, love, rejection, society. Again, I have read through many biographers. There is not one biographer that doubts that Romeo and Juliet was written for Edward Zach in the autumn of the year that Tchaikovsky met this young man. And one of the biographers, in fact a couple of them, right, here for the first time, he voiced the main emotional themes of all his subsequent works. The drama of unfulfilled and frustrated love, and of impossible youthful passion, consumed by omnipresent death. In the case of Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, an intimate link can be seen between this fervent piece of music and a secret drama unfolding in the composer's life at the time of its composition. It portended things to come. A couple of years later, Edward Zach committed suicide. He shot himself in the head. Tchaikovsky never got over that. He was in love with Edward Zach for the rest of his life. Even though he had many other lovers, Edward Zach was always there. In Coda, the character Ivan is Edward Zach, the way I wanted him to be. He then met a lot of other people. Violinist Joseph Kotek. He called him Kotik. Kotik in Russian means pussycat. Chapter 2, the violinist is Joseph Kotek. I don't call him pussycat. He then went with a number of other people. He went with a classmate for a while, Alexei Aputkin, who he went with for a while. Alexei Aputkin became morbidly fat, and that was the end of that. But ultimately, it was Bob Davidov. Yes, in Russian, his name was Bob. I don't know. Bob Davidov was his nephew. He was infatuated with him. He revered him. He was obsessed by him. I don't know for sure if Bob Davidoff was actually gay. I think he was. But I think it was a matter of just obsession. He dedicated his final symphony to him, the Symphony No. 6, the Pathétique. In Russian, Pathétique means passionate. After Tchaikovsky died, Bob Davidoff, a couple of years later, committed suicide, also shot himself in the head. But the Symphony No. 6, the Pathétique, that is an enigma. Don't forget, Tchaikovsky's music is all autobiographical. So what's the story here? It's not unexpected that his last symphony has become associated with his mysterious death. Tchaikovsky wrote to his friends that the piece is programmatic. It's a story. The day after it was performed, Rimsky-Korsakov begged to tell what the story is, and he said, no, the story is in the music. Listen and you'll know. It was premiered in St. Petersburg on October 28th. November 5th, a few days later, he was pronounced dead. During the performance, people commented how he was so vital, so energetic, so happy, so healthful, handsome. A week later, pronounced dead. Nothing has changed in Russia. The music is an enigma. The first movement is beautiful Tchaikovsky melodies. It opens with hummable melodies, and then all of a sudden, unrelated to music before it, unrelated to music after it, the trombones come out with an excerpt from the Russian Mass of the Dead. Autobiographical? We don't know. We know. But it's the last movement. The last movement. It's not bombastic, not blustering bravado like most final movements of a symphony. It starts with a sobbing melody. Sobbing because no one is actually playing it. Let me say that again. Nobody is actually playing it. Rather, the first and second violins and the violas, a little bit of the cellos, are jumping up and down, and your ear is putting together that melody. Da 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 da. Nobody is playing it. The melody is hidden behind a mask. And Tchaikovsky writes about this mask frequently. His life behind a mask. And here, in the final movement of his final symphony, the opening melody is hidden behind a mask. There's a sideline here. His most popular opera, most famous opera, Eugene Onegin. It's a very standard opera plot. Two best friends get into an argument. Eugene Onegin's friend challenges to a duel. The morning of the duel, his friend is alone on the stage. He knows that Eugene Onegin is the better shot. He knows he's going to get it. And he sings on the stage that melody of impending death. Autobiographical? It appears so. Don't forget, a week later, he is pronounced dead. 15 seconds. This takes place Moscow, November 1892, in Tchaikovsky's flat. This is actually a picture of Tchaikovsky's flat later in his life, in his little country home in Klim. pictures on the wall which you can see. Beethoven, Beethoven, Beethoven. Late one evening, while Peter and Ivan were having a quiet time in each other's arms, there was a knock at the door. Peter put a finger to Ivan's lips to let him know to be quiet. He did not want to think he was there. Remembered Edward Zach. Господин Tchaikovsky, his landlady called out in a hushed voice. Peter looked at Ivan, his eyes wide. She screeched in the smallest possible whisper as something might be wrong. Господин Tchaikovsky? Then, from a poke at the landlady's toe, the door slowly swung open, causing Peter to freeze as he saw his landlady holding a tray of poppy seed strudel. Her eyes, wide with fright. The doorway framed an image that Peter feared would cause unwelcome consequences. The landlady stood gaping at Ivan and Peter, who were standing together, not fully dressed, and without saying a word, she gently placed the tray on the floor and turned around. She stood for a moment with her back to the doorway, looking up at the heavens, as she trotted towards the stairs, mumbling and crossing herself repeatedly in broad sweeps. Peter Ilyich and Ivan stood frozen in a failed tableau displayed to a cruel and critical audience. Peter looked at Ivan's terrified face and for a brief moment felt the gravity of the encounter. But his soberness vanished quickly, and a stifled chuckle cascaded into a giggle and broke into a drunken laugh. Ivan's face glowed, and his rosy cheeks nearly clipped his sapphire eyes. This was a happy time to be coveted, but their carelessness would have a price. Ivan asked in a cautious voice, "Is this how it will be, evading every suspecting eye? Will people ever see past the crushing influences of Russian inhumanity?" Peter walked to the other side of the room with his head down, and after a short time turned to Ivan. In one edition of the Beethoven piano sonatas, there's a misprint. A C sharp is printed as a C natural. The printing is so blatantly wrong that any sane pianist would make the correction with little thought. If the correction is not made, the sound is a terrible assault on the ears and the intellect. Nevertheless, one occasionally hears a sonata performed with that wrong note. The pianist would rather have his ears abused with what he must know is wrong than oppose the presumed authority of Ludwig van Beethoven, the Grand Master. The offensive errors repeated in concert again and again by trusting musicians with the fear that disobeying Master Beethoven is beyond their domain of influence. Authority, whether real or perceived, is hard for some to challenge, no matter how it affronts them. This is the Orthodox Church. The next and last piece I want to read to you takes place in the attic of the Moscow Conservatory of Music. At the characters here, this is a contemporary section. The attic, where the eyebrow windows are 2 levels of an attic. In the top level, there's a catwalk across one end, even higher. This takes place May 22nd in this time, and the characters here are Fred, Alex, and Susan. They're searching for evidence that Tchaikovsky had a lover, about Edward Zach, to use as a ransom. Margot, the assassin, Russian assassin, is after them to destroy this evidence and anybody that knows of the evidence. We're up in the attic. When the door flew open, Alex looked through the grate of the catwalk to find Margot standing below him. He closed his hand around the photographs he just found and stood firm. "Oh my God," Susan screamed. Fred stood still, his eyes wide, his mouth open. This was horrific. Margot pointed the gun at Fred, skipping a little bit. Fred did not blink for at least a half a minute, stepped back and raised his hand in front of his face. Margot stood with her gun pointed at Fred. Alex mouthed from behind the catwalk, "No, no, Fred," as Margot moved her finger to the trigger and walked farther into the room. She turned facing the door so Alex could now see her face. He began to shudder. "Please, no, Fred," he mouthed. Silence. Alex prayed that Margot would not look up. "What do you want?" Fred said, skipping a little bit. Margot stood fast with both hands holding the gun pointed at Fred. Alex looked down at Fred, staring at the gun that moved slowly back and forth like a cobra about to strike. Alex watched Susan move slowly away. He put his hand over his mouth and stopped breathing. From the catwalk, Alex glared at Susan and mouthed, "Don't look up, don't look up, don't look up." He moved his hands back and forth. "Do not look up." Susan looked down and Alex breathed a sigh. Alex leaned to move back, but his legs froze by the edge of the catwalk. "Where is the music?" Margot snarled. Then turning to Fred, she said, "And where is Alex hiding?" She took a few steps towards Fred. "Well?" she roared. Alex tried not to move as the photographs dropped from his hand. Margot said, "You don't have a choice. Give me the music." Fred raised his hand as if that would stop the impending bullet. "If we had it, I would give it to you. We have nothing. It was stolen." Margot raised her gun and pointed it at Fred's head. "Last chance." Fred turned his head away. Alex wanted Susan to make a distraction, but she didn't move or say anything. Susan was frozen, breathing heavily, with her mouth opening and closing, but uttering not a single word. Margot turned to Susan, aiming at her chest. Alex looked down at Margot standing on the catwalk. He slowly moved over to a huge wooden box full of manuscripts that was positioned near the edge, aware that the slightest creak would be his death. Alex heard his heartbeat, thumping like kettle drums, and his breathing like a windstorm. He moved as slowly and as noiselessly as possible. He concentrated on sounds from below and coordinated his movement. "Margot, don't," he said. Alex nudged the crate an inch. "No more chances," Margot said. The crate made a squeal moving on the steel grating. Alex backed off, froze, and shut his eyes tight. He tried not to tremble. That wasn't working. Susan glanced up and coughed loudly, which resonated from the far side of the room. "Thank you, Susan," he thought as he breathed deeply. Alex put his hands onto the crate again and nudged it a bit closer towards the edge. It made no sounds as it moved ever so slightly. Alex prodded the crate nearer to the edge, viewed down at his target, and finally gave it a shove. He stood back as it teetered at the edge for a moment and watched it tip, almost balanced. Then, like the slowness of cold honey, it tilted, and with a snarly growl slid the rest of the way off the catwalk. Margot spun around and stared up. She glared at the box as it came straight towards her eyes. Alex inhaled loudly as it seemed to hover in midair, giving Margot enough time to raise her gun. She looked up and fired 3 shots towards Alex. Fred wailed, "No!"